Okay. Well, thank you all very much for joining us today. We're joining live. I'm really honored to have Carolyn Dennett, who is one of the, in my eyes, a superhero who truly followed her heart. And maybe for some, she didn't move from the dark side to the light side, but for me, she did. Carolyn was senior safety manager for Shell and decided, no, this is not where I really want to be. So I'm not going to tell you too much more about her background. I would prefer that she kind of introduces herself. And I think, like many who are not happy with the organization that they're working in, but few actually do follow their heart. I was quite inspired by her for doing that and really moving her into a space that she wanted to be and following her big purpose. So, Carolyn, thank you so much for doing this. And for those of you that are not familiar with your story, you did get a lot of publicity, but let's just repeat to those who don't know your story. Who is Carolyn Dennett, and what did you do at Shell, and why did you leave? And I'll go
Well,
on.
thank you. Thank you, Robert, and thanks everyone who's watching this or with us live. Great to be here. Yes, so I suppose I could give a bit of a backstory to this. So I was never the sort of person who thought they would end up working with a company like Shell. So I guess my background, even going back as far as my childhood, I was probably quite kind of socially and environmentally aware as a child. Injustice was something that really ate at me, particularly, for example, things around racism. I remember watching Roots as a kid. I was very active in the anti-apartheid movement as a 15 and 16-year-old. And, throughout my life, I guess I've never been someone who's kind of chased the mega buck. And certainly I've always seen, I guess, the likes of big oil as not being particularly friendly to our planet. But yeah, something very unexpected happened back in 2011. So this was probably coming up a year after the Deepwater Horizon Gulf of Mexico disaster, which, was the biggest oil spill in history, accidental oil spill in history, appalling impact. Loss of life on board that rig with 12 people who died, and BP faced manslaughter charges for those deaths and were and actually pleaded guilty to them. And the appalling impact on the wildlife there, on the marine wildlife and on the communities who were along that coast. And that made big news, right? I mean, that made absolutely enormous news. And as I mentioned, that was BP, but it could have been any one of the big players out there. They were all kind of practicing in the same way. And I was contacted by a management consultancy via someone in my network who I used to work with, who said, we're looking for someone who can write a survey for us about process safety culture. Can you help us? And I was like, okay, one, I don't really know anything about the oil and gas industry from that perspective. Two, do I really want to work with Shell? I probably saw them as like the tobacco industry. So, we're talking kind of, 14 years ago, like not people I particularly want to get into bed with. And I was very aware of their operations in Nigeria and, the environmental destruction that they caused there, and particularly their involvement, or their alleged involvement, perhaps I should say, in the executions of the Ogoni 9, who were 9 environmental activists from Ogoni land in the Niger Delta. So I was like, oh no, why me? Like, why are you asking me to do this? But I was curious, and I guess as a researcher, I thought, okay, I'll take a look at this. And they seem pretty genuine, actually, I have to say. So at the time, I think Shell were putting quite a lot of effort into their process safety management. And by process safety, that's a bit of a technical term. Basically, it means keeping the oil or the gas or whatever hydrocarbon it is in the pipe. So no spills, basically, and really making sure that the likes of Deepwater Horizon or Piper Alpha or any of those things don't happen. And they had a safety ambition, which was called goal zero, which meant zero leaks and zero harm to people, which sounds moral, right? Sounds good. So I thought, okay, they are genuinely working on this. Maybe they're not quite as bad as I've been led to believe, or I've kind of thought them to be myself. So I was interested, and I thought, well, they do want to do some good here. They want to design a process safety culture survey that would give workers at the front line an opportunity to describe what the reality of that operations is like, how empowered they feel, what leadership is doing, do they have the right kind of tools and resources and budget to operate safely, and to really understand the culture and behaviours at the front line and with frontline management. So I kind of got stuck in, and we agreed that we would write a survey for them, do a pilot. And to be honest, I thought that would be it. I really thought, we'll do this, and then they'll either take it in-house or they'll give it out to some, big consultancy. But they really liked our very tough analytics, and we were very thorough, and it wasn't a tick box exercise that led people to just say everything is fine. It actually genuinely sought to understand where improvement was needed. So yeah, after a kind of 12-month period of piloting, they decided that they wanted to use this as a diagnostic tool to help them understand where their safety performance could be improved. So they said, what would it take for you to do this indefinitely and globally? Which was, again, another surprise. But yeah, we did that. So for the next 10 years, across a multitude of Shell's assets and Shell joint venture assets, we surveyed their workers and their employees and contractor workers, sometimes frequently, sometimes just a one-off. We did that for, like I say, for 10 years. A little interesting side story. So the process safety survey was the main survey, and we then did a second survey, which was around general kind of safety culture, more perhaps about personal safety. And maybe not as surprisingly, in the US, Shell Inc. were very reluctant to use the survey, particularly the process safety survey, because they believed that it would have such litigation power. So if they did the survey in their US assets and nobody actually improved what needed to improve, and something went wrong, like another Deepwater Horizon or less than that, that the other side would have a very strong case that they'd actively neglected this. So they actually kind of said, we'd rather not know than know and do nothing about it, and that be used against us. So that was kind of like, maybe gave me a little bit of an insight to what the culture was really like behind the scenes. But for the most part, I would say the surveys worked really well. The workforce really did use the opportunity anonymously to report what was going on, and there were some horrifying stories. I have to say, people were very honest. Quite often, they would really say how under-resourced they were, that they didn't feel very empowered, that sometimes as a workforce they felt victimized if they tried to raise concerns. So yeah, there was often a real honesty around that. And in some locations, particularly some offshore locations, the stories that the workers told were so frightening and so horrifying that I would have nightmares at night thinking about what could go wrong, and if there was an explosion or a fire, and people would end up in the water, and there'd be loss of life. So it was quite challenging at times, and just even some of the very basic things that people used to say, like they didn't have access to drinking water, or they hadn't been paid, or they didn't have the right protective equipment, would kind of move me to tears, actually, because hearing that from people who feel powerless, I find it quite distressing. But I would endeavour to report all those things to management. They would listen, and they would make overtures to improve things. And I think the leadership teams at the front line genuinely wanted to improve things, but they could only do that if they had budget, basically, and that was a senior management decision, and they didn't always get what they needed. So over time, I kind of saw the same issues on repeat, and actually worsening. So in 2016, there was quite a major oil price crash, and I would say that things never improved after that. Kind of the conditions that people were working in, the desire to maintain equipment and to spend budget on that really did decline. And at that point, I probably started to question, why am I doing this? I'm not sure I'm having the purposeful impact that I thought I would have by improving workers' lives. However, in tandem with all that, my growing awareness of the impact of fossil fuel industry on the environment and on the climate, was growing. So even I say at the start, I probably thought they were just a big dirty polluter, but as my awareness of global warming and then what became more phrased as climate change increased, I joined the Green Party in 2015 and became quite an active election campaign manager, which is bizarre, right? I'm still working for Shell and I'm doing this, but my chums would say, don't worry about it. We've all got to do things that we don't like, or actually it's quite useful to understand what's really going on. So there was a rising conflict of interest, I guess, conflict of values between what I held dear and what I was seeing at Shell. And Shell weren't my only petrochemical client. There were others, but they were probably the biggest and contributed around 70% of my company's, my research agency's revenue. So they were definitely a big client. But as I was going along doing these surveys, still thinking, you know what, but I'm doing good. I'm helping people to have their say. I'm reporting it to management. I'm protecting people from getting injured or from a fatality, or I'm protecting the environment from spills. You tell these things to yourself that you're doing good in order that you can keep going, I guess. But increasingly, I was seeing that they weren't making improvements, and in tandem with that, I was also starting to realise that nobody at Shell that I was working with, and in the 10 years that we worked with them, we surveyed 20,000 employees and contractors, and nobody was talking about climate change. Nobody was talking about a transition. No one was talking about the need to wind down their operations, certainly not at an operational level. However, on the outside, of course, we were getting lots of greenwash and lots of, limp commitments to transitioning or decarbonising their business. But I just wasn't seeing that. And as my concern for the environment was growing, it's now 2019, and I had heard a talk, excuse me a moment, from Extinction Rebellion. Actually, I'd attended a talk called Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. And I thought by then I knew something about kind of global warming and climate change and nature loss, but I realised that I knew nothing really, and that the situation was far worse, as being reported by the International Panel on Climate Change and other scientists. So by 2019, there is a huge conflict of values going on now. And what I'm seeing, I started to see in Shell, they had a business that they called New Energies, which was basically a very small, tiny portfolio of renewable energies, but included kind of hydrogen. It included buying up, acquiring companies that already existed that were manufacturing batteries for solar, some renewable retailing business. And from a moment I thought, is this it? Is this a transition that I need to see? And then actually realized that it was nothing more really than a kind of line on a green line on a portfolio to satisfy investors who perhaps gave a shit about this kind of thing, and that they wanted to kind of prove that they were doing something around a transition. But actually, from talking to people who were working in that division, it seemed like it had become a dumping ground for people who were perhaps considered undesirable at Shell, who, for example, had just narrowly missed redundancy and were heading for the new energy division as a kind of as a last stop, probably before they were exited. So yeah, you know, I'm starting to really question. I questioned a lot, you know, why am I still doing this? But the, you know, the rationalization is still there. I'm doing good. I'm supporting the workforce. I've got the ear of management. I can have influence. I can stop pollution, even in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, which was desperately polluted from Shell's 70-year-long exploitation. But I knew in my heart that this, you know, this was becoming increasingly difficult to live with. And then in 2021, Shell's operations in Nigeria called upon my services again. We'd done loads of work with Shell Nigeria over the years, and they wanted all of their remaining onshore and offshore assets to be surveyed again, because I don't know why they wanted to do that. They had just sold half of all their onshore oil assets, but they wanted to do this. And the first thing they asked me to do was, oh, actually, we've got two surveys we want to run, the standard one for operations, and then actually we've got some new construction projects that we would like to have surveyed. And I said, oh, okay, so we might need to change some of the survey then. And they were like, oh, well, we could rewrite it. And I said, yeah, but if there's only like one or two, there's no point. And then they said, oh, well, no, there's not one or two, there's 12. And I was like, what, you have 12 new oil and gas extraction projects being built in the Niger Delta? And they were like, yeah. And I thought, but this isn't a transition, is it? This isn't winding down on fossil fuel. This is very much still exploiting the hell out of Nigeria. But I kind of felt like at that point, I'd committed to this particular round of surveys. They had identified a need. So I thought, okay, I will do this. And then I think this will be the last that I will do. And that's pretty much, yeah, what happened. By that point, I was so horrified with what Shell were doing globally. I was horrified by the lack of budget and resource that was going into actually maintaining the safety of their operational assets. That I really thought, I can't do this anymore. And I started to think about how do I get myself out of this, and how do I get myself out of this and maybe have impact? Like, how can I leave, and maybe then some good comes out of that, bigger than just, you know, walking away. So I did start to think about maybe I could do something public about this, or just make a statement, or I don't know, even if it was just, you know, a post on LinkedIn saying I've quit or something like that. So I was really starting to think about that. But actually along the side with that was a slight sense of not identity crisis, but identity loss. It probably took me 3 to 4 months to kind of accept that I wasn't going to be that person any longer. I wasn't going to be the safety culture consultant / expert that I built up over 10 years. I was going to throw that away. And then I did think, you know, how can I do this? And then just absolutely coincidentally, I think it was in March or April of 2022, when I'd already decided I was going to go once this project was finished, I saw a action done by Extinction Rebellion at Shell's headquarters in London, where they had gone into the reception, the foyer, and they were kind of dressed like they were office workers, and yeah, they were just doing a bit of disruption, I suppose. They were holding up a poster. I saw this live, actually. It was live on Facebook, and there was somebody who had glued one hand to the desk, the reception desk, and in the other they held a poster that said, insiders wanted, do you want to whistleblow for the planet? And I thought, okay, I might have a plan here. So I contacted them, and I told them my story, and I said, I'm going to go, I'm going to quit, and maybe we could do something that was purposeful and impactful with that. So yeah, so we did. I worked with the Truth Teller team at Extinction Rebellion, and we come up with a plan that on the 23rd of May, I would publicly quit with a video on LinkedIn. And that was the day before the AGM, and we knew that the Shell shareholder AGM, that they would be girding themselves for that, because there's always disruption at those events, and this would kind of come in as a bit of a kind of curveball the day before. So in the lead up to doing that, I think I did have a lot of time to to reflect. And what I really reflected on was a sense of I was about to betray a lot of people, a lot of the 20,000 workers and contractors who over the last 10 years I'd really persuaded to have trust in me, to be the conduit between themselves and management, to fairly represent their concerns and their fears, and that now, you know, out of a sense of absolute privilege, because I could afford to do it, I was going to quit and abandon them. And that's kind of how it felt. On the day that I actually quit, I felt more sad than scared. And trust me, I had looked at some scary things. You know, you don't normally whistleblow on such a big company and come out of it with no consequence. And I had, it might sound dramatic, but I had looked at all of the possible consequences, you know, from, yeah, maybe just, you know, some attempt at some legal action against me, all the way through to, yeah, something far more dramatic. You know, people who whistleblow generally don't come out of their whistleblowing very in a very healthy state. But I just thought, you know what, sod it, I'm going to do it anyway. But I did feel very bad for the people that I was about to abandon. But on that day, I guess I just took a massive leap of faith into the abyss. And we posted a 1-minute video on LinkedIn, which just explained why I was doing what I was doing, why I was quitting. I was quitting essentially because of Shell's double talk on the environment and climate change. And on the one hand, on the outside, they're greenwashing the hell out of this, and yet on the inside, nobody's talking about this. And from a safety perspective, you know, they've got this great ambition of goal zero, no harm to people and no leaks, and yet they are, you know, leaking extensively across the planet, and they are harming people on a global level. So that's what I did. I posted the video. I sent an email to the CEO and the board of directors and about 1,400 workers for who I had email addresses, and life changed from there quite dramatically, actually. So it was a slow news day, very lucky. The press did pick it up, and I guess from Seattle to Sydney, there was press interest, which was great. And I have to say that the response was not what I expected, because instead of like a barrage of hate mail and questions about my sanity, I received, I guess, what felt like a kind of global hug. On LinkedIn, certainly it went ballistic. There were people who were just like so relieved that someone had done this. They were so joyful. They were people who were just like, this is amazing. I you know, I'd love to do the same. And it also made me realize that out there in the business world, there were thousands, tens of thousands of people working on, you know, sustainability, decarbonisation projects that I had not seen. You know, even though I'd become quite an activist, an environmental activist, I guess kind of street level activism, I hadn't seen any of that business stuff. I hadn't realised that there was an army of people across the world who were marching towards, you know, trying to improve our planet, basically, and protect it as well. So it was just, yeah, it was just an incredible experience. And I have to say, to date, I have not felt a single negative consequence so far from what I did, which is astounding, because it doesn't normally go that way for people. I was in a privileged position. You know, I was able to walk away. Lots and lots of people do not have that opportunity. There are people who are comfortably off who could, but there are also people who work at the front line who are literally starving at times, going unpaid, you know, working in extremely dangerous conditions, that don't have that choice. But I felt I do have that choice. I am in that privileged position, and I can do it, and I did. So I'm going to take a breath for a moment.
So the process was like 8 or 9 years from when you were starting to kind of question to leave. What was the reaction? I'm glad that you got a big kind of virtual hug from everybody, but what was the reaction of those that stayed at Shell? Were
Yeah.
they also as embracing and thinking, wow, that's really gutsy. I wish I had the guts to do that. Or, what are you, crazy? This is such a fantastic company. What was the reaction of those?
Yeah, there were some people who kind of like did make an expression. Some people who had left already that I hadn't seen for years. There were some people who I knew, and I'd wonder where they'd gone. Perhaps just in a round of redundancy. When I looked at what they were doing, they were in renewables, they were in sustainability this, sustainability that. So I had really like positive messages from them. There were, you know, there were some trolling going on, but not very much, like 1% maybe. And I guess I don't know what happened because I was not employed directly. I was a contractor. I suppose once
Mm,
I'd kind of done that, dropped the bomb, basically, I knew I wasn't really going to hear from people. But I think I kind of heard, on the grapevine that, well, maybe people understood why I did that. I mean, the response from Shell on the day was very lame. I mean, honestly, vacuous comments about, oh, we are transitioning and all this nonsense. They weren't expecting it, right? So they were expecting disruption the next day at the AGM, and that it wasn't. They didn't think they weren't prepared. It was just such a vacuous statement they made to the press. So I guess, yeah, maybe over time I've heard from other people. I've been part of a research project that was academic research project that was looking at what's been termed, I suppose, climate quitters. So other people who've left the fossil fuel industry for similar reasons, and then people who stay in the fossil fuel industry believing they can change it from the inside. They want to change, they want to see decarbonisation, but they think the best thing to do is to stay in there. So I guess I've kind of heard some of those stories, and it seems like similar. You get yourself into a position, over those 9-10 years that I was there, you just believe you're doing a good job. I loved my job. I loved my job. I worked with really good people in Shell, I guess because I was working with frontline operations. That's kind of different to the corporate functions. I imagine that in the corporate functions at Shell, it is all branding, greenwash bollocks, basically, and that's all they talk about. The PR machine that spins and spins and spins this narrative about transitioning. Back then, they've dropped a lot of that narrative because they don't care. It's drill, baby, drill now, right? They've got license to drill again. But there was a lot of, I think in those corporate functions, there was a lot of belief that there was this transition, and and the greenwash machine was at the operational front line. There was never any talk about that. There was never any greenwashing because they never believed that they were transitioning in the first place. So there was no reason to kind of like put any greenwashing in place. So yeah, I've kind of not I mean, what is astounding, Robert, actually, is I have never had so much as an email from Shell. Like, I have had no response from them other than the response they were forced to give to the press. And I poke them and I prod them at every opportunity. And I still never have any, I've never had so much as a letter saying, you know what, keep your mouth shut because we will take you to court if you don't. And yeah, so it's kind of quite interesting.
I mean, a lot of people don't know that in a previous life, I actually worked on oil rigs in the North Sea, in Iran, in France, in Texas, Colorado. So I know what it is to make a hole in the ground. And there were two things that always struck me, having done that for several years. One, it was not for me. It was not a career that I wanted to do. Two, there were many incompetent people in positions of power running this, and I was always surprised that there were not more accidents like Deepwater Horizon. Um, but most important is that it became clear to me that the reason why those who don't leave, Shell, BP, the big majors, or kind of the transition to OGCI, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, is because it's very easy to get your bonus. All you do is just open the pipeline and you got your bonus. And, actually spending all of that money to fund the infrastructure for the energy transition. Yes, it costs money, but hey, in the 1800s, there were no oil refineries, there were no gas stations, and all of that was also built. But people are very comfortable in the position they are, so they want to keep their heads down. They don't want to create too much trouble, which is probably why you haven't gotten any. They realize they have nothing to gain by going after you. Um, so you took a while to find your big purpose and follow your heart, um, and doing what you're doing now, which I'd like to learn a little bit more about. How do we get more people like Carolyn Dennett who are in BP, Total, Shell, ExxonMobil? Because what a lot of people don't realize is that they're well-run companies. I mean, they treat their employees relatively quite well. I mean, there's a lot of career development and education and training and etc. And they make a lot of money because they're well run, and people are comfortable over there. So how do we get more Carolyn Dennis to come forward? He says, the money is just not worth it. It's just not worth it. It's not giving me the purpose, because you are a minority for sure. But there's probably others who are thinking, gee, I wish I had the guts to do what Carolyn did. How do we get through to them?
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob. I mean, there's a couple of interesting things there. I mean, one, that image of the oil and gas worker, probably managerial level, and it was like that. It was like that back in the day. That kind of had there was a kind of glamour to it, even though it was a dirty job. There was a kind of glamour to that. Things have become so tight. The profiteering, the drive for profit inside those oil and gas companies. People are not being paid like even in the US, even in the US, then the conditions are increasingly difficult for people. They're being squeezed, and of course, then we have where the likes of Shell and BP, Exxon, etc., where other operations that they have, which are not in Western economies, and people are working in appalling conditions. They really are, whether it's onshore or offshore, literally where people, when you've got hard-nosed oil and gas workers who know the risks, they've taken the risks all their lives, saying, I'm afraid to go and work offshore because it's a ticking time bomb, because we don't have fire and gas detectors, we don't have the basic operational tools to keep ourselves safe. Then we've got two groups of people. Basically, we've got people who are quite comfortably off, who are well paid, who've had a great career pathway and have been supported through that, and then we've got people who are being exploited, frankly, and they have no choice because that is the only job in those communities. If I look at Nigeria as a classic example, the level of profit that Shell have had out of that for over 70 years. Actually, they've been extracting in the Niger Delta. The people who work there, a lot of the time they're just using casual contractors because they know they don't then have any workers' rights. They won't get a pension. They don't even actually end up paying them on time. I've had literally contractor workers working in safety critical roles, so not just kind of like sweeping the floor, but in engineering roles in Shell Nigeria, using the survey to say, please sir, can you help us? We are starving. We haven't been paid for 6 months and I can't feed my family. So if you're, how insane is it that you are running an operation where the people who are responsible for driving the oil out of the ground are so diminished, they don't even have food in their bellies coming to work? I mean, that's an axis of evil, right? That is beyond not just what's right for the planet wholesale, but what, from a humanitarian point of view, that seems really exploitative. So you do have these two groups of people, and I think amongst those who are in a more privileged, comfortable position, I think I think there's been quite an exodus. They haven't, done it with the drama that I did it, but they have, and there is a crisis, I think, in the oil and gas industry, in that people are leaving and they're not being replaced. They're not being replaced because lots of young people just don't want to work. Graduates coming through that would have naturally gone into the petrochemical industry, whether they're mechanical engineers or whether they are chemical engineers, technicians. They're just, those, I've spoken with those students. I've been to University College London and sat down having discussions with chemical engineering students and not one of them said they wanted to work in the fossil fuel industry. They might end up working in the fossil fuel industry, but they want to do something way more purposeful with their life. So there is this step change. There has been a bit of a kind of great resignation in some respects, more quietly than I did it, and then there is this refusal to go into that. So, I think there is some tension building there that hasn't happened for the last 70 years, where people have thought that these jobs are great. One, the conditions in which people are working are not great because they're sweating the assets. They're trying to get as much oil out of these, some of them very aging assets now. And then, for others, people just don't want to be part of they don't want to be part of the destruction of the planet. They'd rather do something else. So I think there are shifts happening. I see it.
You mentioned something which I had to laugh because you were saying about being very glamorous. I just want to share this slide. This is me working on the oil rigs. Glamorous it was not. It was definitely not glamorous. It was messy and muddy and hot and tiring, but glamorous, nah, maybe for some of the others, but
Brilliant.
I mean, we had 4 weeks on, 4 weeks on, so I could, travel. But I was just amazed that the number of really incompetent people in positions of power, and I would have discussions with them. I'd say to them, you're working 6 months on a rig and you're 6 months at home. So you're away from your family half your life. And the French would say to me, yes, but when I come back, it's like a honeymoon. So I said, so you have to be away from your family half your life to make your life a honeymoon? Is that, the story? But I said, the choices for someone who didn't have a good education were limited. And this was, well paid and et cetera. But it's interesting that it might be harder attracting those. And there's a TV show now called Landsman, which you might find interesting, with Billy Bob Thornton, about the oil and gas sector in Texas. It's very well done, very, very well done. And the challenges, out there. There's a lot of nonsense in the show, but so I'm fascinated to hear that you're saying that it's getting tougher for the oil and gas majors to attract, the best and the brightest. Doesn't mean that they're going to run out of people to do the work. There aren't that many people working on an oil rig and doing exploration. It's not like thousands of people, maybe maybe in the processing of that. But do you get phone calls from former colleagues or colleagues from BP or Exxon or some of the others, and they say, Carolyn, I respect that you did that. I'm at that point. What do you tell them? I'm at that point that I can't do this anymore. I can't, keep being the heroin dealer, basically selling heroin, in this case, fossil fuels, and profiting from that. It's just, I just can't do it anymore. So what do you find the trigger to get people to really say, okay, I'm out of here. This is enough. Is it just, do
Yeah.
they have to have a big pile of cash built up before they make that move?
No, I think what they have to do is come to the conclusion that staying in, you can't change it from the inside. And I think there's been, the research project that I was involved with was about that. These two similar people who are climate aware, are concerned for the environment, concerned for the planet. So, you kind of start off in the same place and then you diverge, because one group believes that the only way you can make changes to leave, and the other group say, the only way you can make changes to stay. So you stay because you believe you can change it from the inside. And then actually, you ask, and then they give you a job in the sustainability department, right? Or the transition department, or the low carbon department, or whatever it is. And then you kind of, then you're back to where I was, and you believe you're doing good. And actually, we can change this from the inside. And, and I've heard those voices. I've been on, let's say this research project about that, where they genuinely believe you then kind of got a false optimism, because you then genuinely believe, I am working in the low carbon division. And then in the case of Shell last year, Wael Sawan, the new CEO, just made mass redundancies, 300 people redundant from the low carbon division, because he literally put two fingers up and said, we're just going all out for new exploration. So then there's another dawning, do I stay or do I go? And I think, that's the difficulty. I think for some people, they believe you have to change it from the inside. My belief was they are never going to change because they don't want to change. There's no motivation for them to change. There's no carrot, there's no stick, there's none of it. They are in control. So I think that's really, so my sense would be, do it. Just go. There are loads of things out there you can do. Those skills are transferable completely. Just start by looking for another. You don't have to commit commercial suicide, which is what I effectively did, but I'm fine. I've survived. It's absolutely fine. And I think, I think there has been a huge migration out of the fossil fuel in industry. And I think as a result, they have lost a lot of engineering talent, and that does make their operations more unsafe. There's no doubt about that. Even when I was, on the last few surveys I worked on, there was lots of people saying we're hemorrhaging talent. Like we are left with people, the only people who were left working here are the people who are, frankly, they don't know what they're doing. And they know they don't know what they're doing. And it's scary shit, because if you are working in that environment, particularly offshore, and you've got people who are just filling in on safety critical roles, on operational critical roles, and they don't know what they're doing, and they're hungry, and they're tired, and they're stressed. I mean, it is just a recipe for increasing disasters, and I mean, certainly in Shell, and go back to Shell Nigeria, I mean, those assets are leaking all of the time, and the disaster that is, the Niger Delta, and the amount of pollution there's been, is a perfect example of that level of exploitation. It's really poor. But I guess on a more positive note, it'd be good to talk about some of what happened next, kind of like what happened.
Please.
Yeah. So kind of what happened next was really, I just became connected with genuinely some life-changing kind of projects and life-changing people, including yourself, Robert. So you, I think actually on the day I quit, you were like the first person who personally messaged me, like to say, can we talk about this? So I then was obviously left with a big hole in terms of the workload, but I started researching renewable energies. Actually, historically, I got involved with someone who told me about a clean energy innovation that had been around many years ago, and he felt that there was more out there, and if only we could, what if we got together and we could nurture those innovations that were there. So I did start researching clean energy technology that had been around for the last 120 years that never made it. Well, some of it did. We did have electric vehicles in New York for about 20 years before the internal combustion engine took hold. So there have been technologies around. There's been clean energy. So I started researching that with all seriousness. So of course there's a lot of conspiracy stuff out there. There's a lot of gumph out there, but there's also genuine stuff. And we know that this is what the competition does, right? You know, a lot of those technologies which were patented were bought up by the fossil fuel industry because these are competitive products, and then they just sit on them, right? They just sit on them to ensure that these things never happen. But then when I'd kind of finished doing that, and I had, you know, a nice little research book of it, we actually started connecting with people who currently have clean energy innovations. And they're the kind of people who are not likely to come across an investor or an academic research institution because they're kind of garage inventors, I guess. But that's not to say that their inventions aren't valuable. They are incredibly. So I then formed a business which is called Infinicity, whose purpose really is to accelerate the energy revolution and in doing so protect and enhance the natural environment, and really importantly provide energy equity for everyone everywhere. So we've done that. We're working with 3 clean energy technology innovators on some really exciting stuff. And as part of that research, you know, what I've come across is there's tons of renewable energy out there that has been built, infrastructure that's been built, wind turbines, solar, offshore stuff that is not connected to the grid right now. So actually, to the extent that there's 3,000 gigawatts of renewable energy projects that have been built and are sitting idle, unconnected. And in order to connect that 3,000 gigawatts and everything that has planning permission to be built between now and 2030, we would need another 80 million kilometers of grid infrastructure, wiring and other infrastructure, which is the size of the current international grid. So to connect all that stuff that's globally, that is currently sitting idle, we would need, you know, another grid. Well, that's not going to happen, is it? You know, that's not going to happen. So what we're very focused on as Infinicity is actually looking at localization of energy production and supply. So with the help of AI, actually, we can now have microgrids and we can have virtual power plants. So actually in a community, you could have much more community-owned renewable energy production and supply. And the technologies that we're working with are particularly good at that. They're kind of quite small scale, and you could have either, you know, individual homes having them completely off grid or connected to a microgrid and having peer-to-peer selling of spare capacity and spare kilowatts, etc. So that's really what we're kind of working on. We have, again, thanks to you, Robert, because it was through you that we became connected. I've been working with Sustainable Network as a kind of support partner, and just this beginning of this year, we've signed a partnership agreement with them. So they're supporting Infinicity, because although we've done lots of research and we're kind of supporting ourselves, I'm doing it just from my own savings, and we do now need investment in order to see R&D through properly, so that these devices can be further developed and, you know, properly tested and made safe and reliable, so that we can get them out there into people's homes and into communities. So, you know, that's something really, really positive that's come of this. I've kind of used my experience in the energy industry, as it were, to have real purpose. Yeah, we've got lots of wonderful partners that are working alongside us, from kind of architects to engineers and marketeers, etc. So I feel very good about that. Everything that we do is based on kind of conscious contracting. So conscious contracting is actually kind of turning our back on the traditional legal infrastructures that are there, the legal frameworks that are there, as a terrible way to do business. They generally are. Usually they're about what I'm going to do to you if you even accidentally do something bad to me. You know, I'm going to take you to court, I'm going to sue your ass, I'm going to do all these things. Conscious contracts is not about that. It's about actually partnership agreement, and how do we manage if things go wrong, like, you know, how do we manage that? They're still legally binding, but it just means that you are doing that with a much more purposeful and mindful approach. So we're using conscious contracts in that. We've had a really fabulous conscious contracts practitioner called Chuck Kanafi, who has guided us through that. And yeah, so we're really, really pleased with the way that is going. And I suppose as recompense for the profit that I had from working with Shell in Nigeria, which I never felt good about because I know the devastation that they've caused there. I have kind of co-founded a network called Justice for Nigeria, which is very, very focused completely on getting Shell to clean up the damage that they've done, which they've been ordered to by various organisations, including the UN and courts around the world, and they refuse to, and to pay up for the damage that they've done. And so we're very focused on that. There is some this year is a big year for that campaign. Coming up on starting on the 13th of February, there will be some major court cases in the High Courts in London brought against Shell by Niger Delta communities. So that's starting on the 13th. This year is also the 30th anniversary of the execution of the Ogoni 9 activists. So there's quite a lot around that. And Shell, of course, if people aren't aware, they're kind of washing their hands of all the dirt that they've caused in the Niger Delta, because they have just sold off all of their onshore oil assets as a way of shirking their responsibility and accountability for past harms and the harms that I know are to come. So those assets are in appalling condition operationally. They are old, they are rusting, they are unmaintained, and they have sold them to a local consortium in the Niger Delta. Ironically, 90% of the management team it's called Renaissance, are ex-Shell managers. And Shell, it's a level of corruption that is just insane. Shell are selling it, but they've also they're lending them the money to buy their own assets, and they'll still have a 30% stake. Right. But the way that they have designed the legal framework around that, they are hoping that Shell will no longer be liable for any future leaks or worse that come from those assets. Meanwhile, they're going all out for offshore oil and gas because they know that there's huge profit to come from that. So I've kind of, I'm very close with the people in those communities who are really struggling to survive. And we're doing all that we can to raise awareness globally for the shame that Shell should feel for what they've done, particularly in the Niger Delta, where people can no longer farm or fish. They don't have access to clean water. And yet, the world benefits from all the oil and gas extraction that has gone on there. And that's partly the Nigerian government's fault and very majorly Shell's fault. So yeah, so there's been some really, I feel like my purpose bucket is very overfloweth. And yeah, I'm glad I did what I did. I have zero regrets. And yeah, it's definitely changed my life for the better. And I have become connected with just some really fabulous people like yourself, Robert.
Well, thank you. Well, Barbara had a question, Barbara Erskine, who also, she was very senior at the World Economic Forum. She was one of the people that actually made the World Economic Forum famous when nobody ever heard of it and left. So she had a question. And one thing I want to mention, you might want to check out rowanenergy.com. David Duckworth as a potential partner.
I know David. I do know him.
Okay.
We've met.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So he might be helpful. So Barbara was asking, so how can the international community push back on Trump declaring that the U.S. is full in on fossil fuels? Who can the public connect with? We can already put on the TBLI circle. I'm not really that bothered because the money flows in the decarbonization direction will only increase because there's money to be made there. And the financial sector is just a predictable group of alpha males who run up the hill and jump off a cliff at the same time. So I'm not really that concerned about it, but I do know others that are really quite frightened about that, and I'm just curious, what can we do to push back?
Yeah, I think the best way to push back is to build the alternative underneath it. I think that's I don't know if they've got any libertarian values about them at all, the Trump administration, which they kind of claim they have, and they've got a whole bunch of libertarian style people, in with them. Then take advantage of that and just build the alternative. These the renewables that are already available, those that I'm aware of and that we're pushing to get out there, are ideal for community energy schemes. Just build the alternative. Just do that and get yourself off the grid. And you can live. I know that the global impacts of more oil and gas, but you know what I mean. I just think we have to just start communing and build the alternative, and they'll become irrelevant. But I'm with you, Robert. I think the money has already turned. I think there is too much invested in in the new way of doing things, for it to have for it to devastate all the progress that we've made. We haven't made that much progress, but we've been going in the right direction. So yeah, I think just build the alternative system, and that the other one will become irrelevant.
Yeah, because if you look at the continuous money flows and decarbonization, it's not going as fast as we need, but the money flows are clearly happening there. The cities and states in the U.S. will also take a leadership role in addressing climate. They can drill all they want, but they also have to accept the fact that there is a whole electrification of the car industry, which was not going to use as much fossil fuels ultimately. So I'm not really that bothered by it, and I still know that Trump is a master at crash and burn. And he will, basically, last week he fired the safety person in aviation, and today there was a massive airplane crash, of which leading Russian athletes were killed in that plane crash. So he will just crash and burn. Musk won't get the attention that he wants, so he'll start fighting, and they'll fight with each other. So it's unfortunate that the educational system of the U.S. is based on local property taxes, which why you get so many idiots actually believing everything that he does. And it's just very, very, sad to see this slow motion car accident, but at the same time, it has energized a lot of people to say, hey, we really have to, push back. I'm a bit concerned short term about the challenges of climate really kicking in and starting to become so apparent that we won't be able to do much about it. But long term, I have confidence in the greed of the financial sector that they can see they can make money on this. How can we're coming to the end, how can the audience that are watching live and those that will watch the replay, which will be the vast majority, how can we help you?
Yeah, collaborate. I think that's what we've got in our favor, in our camp, is collaboration. And I think those other people, the Trump and the they're for competition, aren't they? And they, like I say, they will eat themselves in the end. They will just fight over each other, and the egos will get in the way, and the competition and all that will. Whereas I think the time for the great collaboration is here, and that's part of building the alternatives, whether that's the alternative legal framework with conscious contracts, or the alternative way of investing that we're kind of embracing with sustainable network, or how we build the infrastructure that we need for the future. I think collaboration is a massive part of that. And again, it's kind of I'd say it's what big power and big corporations, they they don't like that. They don't want us to collaborate, but I think that's what we can do. So I think, yeah, if anyone's interested in what we're doing in terms of the clean energy tech that we're working on, and the system and the alternative systems that we're working on, so and the way that we're going about that and our purpose, then yeah, please get in touch with me. So it would be Caroline@infinicity.com. It's spelled Infinicity, you can see there on my tag, INFINECITY.
And Carolyn is very accessible, and when we post the replay, we'll post a link to her LinkedIn, so you can follow up with her. I thank you, Carolyn. Thank you so much for doing this, but also for following your heart and going in different direction and choosing your big purpose. I totally agree with you about the whole issue about trying to change the companies from within. I used to teach MBA students, and I would jokingly use a Larry David video where he was advising in Curb Your Enthusiasm to Leon how to get this job. And he said, if you want to get this job, you got to turn, flip it around that you interview the recruiter. And I would tell all the MBA students, if you want to change business, don't work for companies that recruit you, and tell them why you won't recruit them. But unfortunately, almost all the MBA students were all worried about their student loans, and they never followed their heart, and they never did that, But that is the most powerful way. Don't work for them. Thinking that you're going to change it from within is, that's completely mentally nuts. You're never going to change anything, particularly a very large company that's also financially successful. But refusing to work for them when you're a ranked MBA student or that you're a senior professional, that has more influence. So thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing. And if there's anything that we can do to help you, the replay will be ready, shortly. But Sam will process it and add an intro, and we'll push that out probably in the next week or so.
Thank you.
And Carolyn, don't hesitate to contact us. Don't hesitate to contact Glenn or Shinye-san or Barbara. They're great assets, and many are on the TBLI circle. So use that resource. They're excellent. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone for coming. And thanks to Rune as well, who's there, who I owe a message to. So I will get back to you, Rune. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rune. You stay well. See you soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.